Ralph, welcome to the show.
Really, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
I'm so happy to have you here, Ralph, because you're bringing up a topic that people will say when we do shows like this. The first thing they'll say is, but what does it matter? What's the value?
Exactly. And that's exactly what I'll talk about. But in all of this gloom and doom scenario that is we're all facing, there's actually a beautiful story to be told. And we are all part of it. And it has a very happy ending. And so all it needs is a certain action that we need to take, which is very much within our remit, all of us. And we can do it at all levels, from the international to the local to on the citizen level and so forth. And we can actually reverse many of what's happening around us. So that's what I want to tell you. But I'm going to build up that story for you and for your audience. And please ask me any questions that may come to your minds. I'd be more than happy to help answer them.
We will, and we'll let you have the stage here. We'll be back at the end to do that. We'll have a Q&A with you as soon as you're done. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much. What I'd like to do is share my screen. Okay. So here we go. I'm just trying to get my computer. Here we go. Okay. So as the hosts mentioned, the title of my talk is The Value of Nature to Our Health and Economic Well-Being. But what I'd like to do first is contextualize where we are right now, what's really going on right now. So currently, the world is really focused on what we call the climate change risk, the risk that we are all facing. But what maybe some don't understand is that there are two risks that we're facing at the same time. If you listen, for example, to Sir David Attenborough, he's talking about what he calls the risk to nature, or what we call economists. We call it natural capital. So what's happening is, as we are focused on climate change and what we ought to do in order to mitigate that risk, there's something else that's at risk and in real time, which is the risk to nature in terms of the demise of the forests and the species and the tremendous impact on the oceans that we're hearing about. And so these two risks are happening at the same time. And these two risks are actually linked together. They're linked together through the human activity that's causing much of this harm. So we can't really just focus on climate change and then say, okay, let's fix that first, and then we will turn and try to fix the dangers that we're imposing on Mother Nature. Because if we leave that, if we do it sequentially, the Mother Nature, the species are dying at a very, very high rate. And the danger that's coming from the natural world is enough to actually cause the demise of or the extinction of the human race. So we can't just do climate and then look to fix our attitude towards nature. We really need to tackle both risks at the same time. Question is, how do we do so? Are these two risks linked? And as I mentioned before, indeed, they are linked through the human activity. But let me just bring you up to date on where is the world on all of this. Well, the Paris Accord, which is supposed to be dealing with, and the commitments that are made at Paris Accord at the sovereign level and now at the corporate level, are meant to deal with reducing or ensuring that the temperatures don't rise beyond 1.5 or 2 degrees. At least that's what they tell us. And they've summarized the activity around carbon reduction and offsetting. Okay, so they summarized it in more or less in sort of one measure, which is carbon, how much carbon is being emitted into the atmosphere and how much already exists in the atmosphere. And our actions in terms of we should be reducing our carbon emissions and we should be offsetting whatever carbon is up there in the atmosphere. So that's from an economist point of view, from a sort of a market point of view. We're looking at this saying, oh, that means there's an insatiable demand by the world at the sovereign level and at the corporate level to reduce carbon emissions and to offset carbon emissions. So there's demand for a technology that can do so. So the question is, you have demand, but where will the supply come from? What is the technology that is out there that can really help us reduce the carbon emissions and or offset our carbon footprint? Well, there are two options here. You can go high tech, and you can go what I like to call earth tech. And the high tech is sort of what you hear right now, all kinds of gimmicks coming up saying, well, we have this technology that can help grab all the carbon from the atmosphere and maybe that, and pump it back into the ground, and maybe that would fix it. Well, the issue with that one is we don't know anything about this technology. This is technology that is untried. And we don't know whether by doing that is even the right thing to do, because you're pumping the carbon back into the ground. We don't know whether it should be in the ground or in the places where they intend to pump it back into the ground, for example. The other thing is that even if we did have that technology, that does not stop the ocean from dying. That doesn't stop the whales from dying. That doesn't stop the elephants from dying. That doesn't stop all these species from extinction, because those species are at risk not because of carbon, they're at risk because of human activity. Whales are dying in the oceans, not because of carbon issues, they're dying because of ship strikes, sonar testing, plastic pollution, being caught in these ghost nets, and so forth. So going the high-tech route is not enough, and it's untried. There's the earth tech approach. According to the IUCN, we know very well that the earth, that Mother Nature can help absorb a minimum of 37% of all that is demanded in terms of carbon sequestration. That's a minimum of 37%. And the other thing about earth tech, Mother Nature has been around for at least 4 or 5 billion years. So it's very much a technology that's been tried and true. There are no surprises here with the Mother Nature. So what I want to focus on is how can we use the natural capital, meaning using nature in helping nature to basically recuperate, and then use nature in order to reduce climate change. So we reduce the risk to Mother Nature, and I'll tell you what actions we need to take. And then by doing so, we mitigate or reduce two risks: the risk to the natural capital and the risk to climate change. But before I talk about solutions, we have to understand how we arrived at this situation. Well, we arrived at this situation because our current paradigm, and somehow we kind of went off course, if you like. It started, if you were interested in sort of the history of this, some people dated back to the Cartesian paradigm. This is the Descartes approach, which basically gave value only to the mind over the corporeal body. So Descartes, sort of put all emphasis on sort of the mind, and the body was of less importance, thereby divorcing humans from their natural world. So the current paradigm, the Industrial Revolution that came afterwards, was all about sort of we are outside of nature. Nature is infinite, and we're endowed with infinite commodities. So we can do whatever we want. We can pollute, we can extract, we can kill, do all that stuff, and don't worry about it because it's infinitely supplied. So the chart that I'm showing in front of you, the figure that I'm showing, is to show you what does that mean visually. It means that somehow we think that we're outside of nature, that we somehow can grow outside of nature. And so we do our own thing, and then we look around and say, oh, our actions resulted in some cost to nature. And economists, my colleagues, would like to call it sort of an externality, and we should fix it through some taxation or something of the sort. But what has happened is we've arrived at this situation, whereas nature is not really external to us. And what's happened is everything that we've done to nature has come boomerang back to us in terms of all kinds of disasters that we are now experiencing at more frequent basis. And the most recent one, COVID. I mean, imagine COVID. This is a virus that you can't see. Presumably took place in a wet market that you and I will probably never visit. It brought humanity to its knees. It has cost close to 5 million, if not more, in terms of death, losses in terms of global growth in the negative, if you like, and millions more pushed back into destitution and increasing the inequality between the rich and the poor. So obviously this this behavior of ours of thinking that somehow we're outside of nature is not sustainable. And we persist, if we were to persist on this track, we persist at our own peril. So question is, what is the right track? Well, the new economic paradigm is, if you ask the indigenous populations and old civilizations, they'll all tell you something they've always known, which is we are part of nature. Nature is our home. After all, we can't do without water, without soil, without oxygen. No matter what the prices are, you need those. You need nature. Nature is where we reside. Nature is our home. Just like I'm talking to you from my home today. My home is, has a roof. It keeps the rain away from me. It has walls, windows, keeps the wind. But I also have to look after it. I do all the maintenance that is needed, and then the home looks after me. We have taken nature for granted for too long of a time. And what nature is sending to us is signal after signal that we need to change our behavior. We live inside of nature. We can only grow if nature grows. And if nature is suffering, we're going to suffer. So question is, how do we take this paradigm that nature is our home? How do we make it operational? How do we counter the current paradigm that says, no, we're really outside of nature. We can do whatever we want. All of this is telling us is nature is important for our economics, if you like, economic well-being, and to our health. Who tells us that? Well, who tells us that is science. The scientists have been telling us this for a very long time. Okay, since this is about the oceans, let's go to the oceans. Okay, according to the UN, the oceans are the lungs of the planet. In the oceans float these incredible microscopic organisms called phytoplankton. Phytoplankton it gives out more than 50% of all the oxygen that we breathe. And in return, sucks in over 30% of the carbon dioxide that is produced due to human activity. Imagine. If you'd like to know how important is the function of the phytoplankton in the oceans, they're equivalent to 4 Amazon forests per year. That's how much carbon dioxide phytoplankton in the ocean absorb in terms of carbon dioxide. After all, it shouldn't be a surprise to us because 4/5 of the planet is water. We only reside on 1/5 of that planet. Okay. What does science also tell us? This is all coming from the science. They tell us that these incredible beings in the water, the great whales, do something incredible, aside from them being intrinsically incredible, but they do something for humanity that is really cool just from doing their own thing. So what the great whales do, they carry carbon in their body. How much carbon? On average, if you look across all the 9 species of the great whales, on average, they carry 9 tons of carbon in their body, in their tissue. That's equivalent to keeping, if you multiply that by 11/3, that's equivalent to keeping 33 tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That is equivalent to the work of 1,500 trees. So one whale, one great whale, carries on its body in terms of carbon equivalent to what 1,500 trees would have to do in order to grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So what's so great about that? Well, those creatures are so heavy that when they perish, when they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. And beyond 200 meters, wherever you have carbon, it gets sequestered for hundreds of years. And if it falls all the way down to the bottom, it's sequestered for thousands of years. Why do they sink? Because they are negatively buoyant, because they're so heavy. So the whales are actually keeping quite a bit of that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere just on their body. But they do something else that's really very interesting. Those great whales, they're mostly baleen whales. They don't have teeth, they have a sieve, and they swallow a tremendous amount of water. And then they allow that water to gush out, and they trap inside their mouth the krill. And the krill is these very tiny, sort of like shrimp-like creatures. And that's what they feed on. So imagine in your head a triangle. The base of that triangle goes from a whale. The whale eats krill. Now, the second arm of that triangle, the krill, in order to survive, needs to feed on phytoplankton. So that's the phytoplankton. For it to survive, it needs nitrogen, it needs phosphorus, and it needs iron. And guess where those three nutrients are found? They're found in the poop of the whale. So, as my colleagues say, it's all about poop. So these whales, in their poop, they have nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. So what happens when these whales arrive at a scene? They release their fecal plumes at the surface, which fertilizes the phyto. And when the phyto gets fertilized by the fecal plumes of these whales, they become more productive. So they suck in more carbon dioxide, and there's more of phyto. If there's more phyto, there's more krill. There's more krill, there's more food for these incredible creatures. So this virtuous cycle of the whales feeding on the krill feeding on the phyto, and the phyto needing the nutrients that are in the fecal plumes of the whales, are all helping to capture even more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So what I did with my colleagues in 2019, we looked at how much carbon, by the way, this is all, let me stop here and say, this is not something that I discovered. The scientists had already discovered this. This is work of Andy Pershing of 2010, Joe Roman 2014, Lavery, Heidi Pearson, and others that have actually documented all of this. But we, the non-scientists, the non-oceanists, didn't know anything about this. Anyway, so what I did with my colleagues, we are financial economists. We wanted to understand how much carbon is the whale contributing to, especially because of the climate change. Turns out that one whale, through the amount of carbon it captures on its body and the amount that it captures indirectly through its fertilization of phytoplankton, one whale is equivalent to thousands of trees, okay? So that's coming from the science. What else does the science tell us? Now let's go to their cousins on land. This is a paper by Fabio Berzaghi and colleagues who published this in Nature Journal 2019. What they discovered is that the cousins of the whales on land, the elephants, these are the forest elephants of Africa, also sequester carbon in the trees. Well, how do they do so? Turns out that these elephants are very picky as what they like to eat. First of all, they move through the forest. These are not, by the way, the savanna elephants that you go see when you go on a safari. These are unfortunately hidden in the forests of Africa in countries that are going through civil strife. And that's why a lot of them are dying, and they're dying very quickly. But what they do for us is incredible. As they move around in the forest, they trample over the small shoots, and they have a proclivity for eating low fiber trees, allowing much bigger trees to grow bigger, wider, and taller because there's more sunlight coming in, more rain, more nutrients, and they defecate, basically fertilizing the whole forest. What they discovered, those scientists, is that those elephants are increasing the forest sequestration of carbon by at least 7%. Imagine. And they also find out that when those elephants cease to exist in certain parts of the forest loses its ability to sequester carbon. So it's the interaction of fauna and flora that is actually leading to the additional sequestration of carbon. Just like the whales are interacting with the krill and the phytoplankton, it's that system that is helping the oceans absorb tremendous amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. What else does science tell us? Science tells us that salt marshes, seagrass, mangroves, all of these systems, these are referred to sometimes as blue carbon. They also help to sequester tremendous amount of carbon in the roots. They are also incredible systems of defense against flooding. And they also provide for greater fish stocks. This is all coming from the world of science, all published work in science. So what does science tell us is that biodiversity is incredibly valuable. Meaning what? Meaning a living whale is incredibly valuable, not a dead whale. A living elephant is valuable, not a dead elephant. A living forest, living coastal blue carbon. The lesson here, a living nature is valuable to us, okay? Yet, here's a conundrum for somebody like me coming from the markets. When I taught economics, I used to be a professor, and every student of economics learns this, or finance, that price comes from value. If something is valuable, it has to have a positive price. So when I tell you that a whale is capturing carbon, it's increasing fish stocks, and there's whale tourism industry that is multi-billion-dollar industry. So a living whale is very valuable. So it should have a positive price on its services. The answer, unfortunately, is not. Today, if a ship were to strike a whale, and we see it sometimes coming into the port of Los Angeles with this incredible creature skewered on its bow, it pays no penalty. There's no penalty for killing a whale, whether by mistake or on purpose. In fact, in some countries where they still eat whales, the dead whale fetches $40,000. So how is it that a living whale fetches nothing, whereas you kill a whale, chop it to pieces, feed it as meat, suddenly it acquires $40,000? Same thing with the elephants. That's why the elephants are dying. They're not dying, due to natural causes. They're dying due to poaching, encroachment on their habitats. So you poach, unfortunately, an elephant, cut off its tusk, sell the ivory. A trophy hunt would fetch you $40,000. So what's really missing? What's missing is the following: is when we talk to people about preserving or conserving nature, the first thing that appears that people's imagination is, how much is this going to cost? So when you, as a conservationist, go out and ask for donations, from the perspective of the giver, the person who's going to give you, is either they give you because they care about the creature, or if you want to, you're approaching a policymaker or the financial markets, they look at it from a cost-benefit analysis. They're going to say, how much is this going to cost me to conserve something, preserve something? So much dollars. Then the next question they're going to ask you is, what do I get in return? What do I get in return for the cost of preserving the whales or the elephants or mangrove, seagrass, salt marsh, what have you? The answer, typically, the benefit resides in science. Meaning the scientist would answer, oh, the benefit is ecosystem services or biodiversity. And by that time, you have lost the person who's making the monetary decision. Because the person sitting in front of you who has the money is not a scientist, may not be even interested in the intrinsic value of nature. They're looking at it from purely cost-benefit analysis. And they understand the cost because it's in dollars and cents. But now when you answer them in terms of science, there's apples and oranges. They can't make up their minds. And what you don't realize as a scientist trying to conserve a species or a body of land or water is that you are competing with an alternative proposition that the policymaker is being offered. For example, you say, well, we need to protect our estuaries or seagrass or salt marshes, and you can't provide a monetary benefit. What happens is, as you leave the room, another person walks in and offers the policymaker a new marina that's going to provide so much tax revenue for the city or for the local government. You've lost the conversation. So what I did with my colleagues is we looked at the benefits in science, and we translated those benefits in science into dollars and cents. Why? Because I'm not interested in having a conversation with conservationists because they are already, I call them the converts. We're trying here to bring on board the policymakers, financial markets that have tremendous resources and ability to make decisions, who for the longest time been left out of the conversation. We demonize them. We call them, you guys are no good. So they said, okay, fine, we're out of this conversation. But we are facing climate change. We can't afford anybody being outside the tent. We need everybody inside the tent to solve this problem that faces us all. So we need to speak a language that these people who are not conservationists, okay, or philanthropists, a language that they can understand. And they understand the language of dollars and cents. So let's see if we can convert the science, the benefits that exist in the science, to dollars and cents, and then come back to these people and say, okay, now would you give me money in order to protect these species or the forests or the ocean? So let's see what happens. When we did so, this is our first paper of 2019, we looked at the value that one whale provides over its lifetime. Okay, in terms of carbon sequestration, well, there's a market for carbon, there's a price for carbon. In terms of fish stocks, there's a market for fisheries. And in terms of whale tourism, and there's a market for whale tourism. So when you look at the cash flows that are produced from one single whale over its lifetime, so this is not the value of a whale, this is the value of the services that the whale provides. Okay, turns out that one whale provides services equivalent to $2 million as a minimum. Imagine, whereas a dead whale fetches $40,000 for its meat. This is a living whale. Leave it alone. It provides society a value of $2 million. And by the way, that's just the minimum. We did the same thing with the science. Before I go to the elephants, I want to show you, we did this work for Chile and for Brazil. And Brazil, in terms of because they have about 65,000 different species of whales in their waters, that is equivalent to over $80 billion in terms of wealth for Brazil, just coming from the carbon services that these whales provide, fish stocks, and whale tourism. Chile has this very famous blue whale, Chilean blue whale, and they have about 750 of them left. Okay, and that is worth at least $4 billion, even more so because the price of carbon keeps going up. Okay, what else can we do? We can look at the carbon benefits that an elephant, a forest elephant, provides to humanity. Remember why we're harping on this, because right now the whole world is trying to figure out, how do we sequester carbon? Well, guess what? Nature is in front of us saying, hey, I can help you out. Why don't you come here? Allow me to breathe. I can help you with the fight of climate change. So when you value this carbon services alone of one elephant over its lifetime, it's at least $1.75 million. Here's a more shocking number for you. This is fresh work that I'm doing for UNEP, along with my colleagues. We were asked to value seagrass globally. Just in terms of carbon sequestration alone, seagrass would generate, if we were able to sell the carbon services to those that need them, over $1 trillion in revenue to the countries where this seagrass exists. Imagine. So when you look at all this, what we're really telling everyone is, in light of the climate calamity and the demand for carbon, if we just focus on carbon sequestration alone, nature can help us in this sense, can suck up a lot of that carbon and can generate revenue for the countries and localities where these natural assets exist. So what we're really defining is a new source of wealth, a new class of assets. So we started with the science. The science tells us nature is very important to our well-being and to our economic system. We as financial economists come around and say, okay, can we value this so in order to compare it with the cost of looking after it? And indeed we can. And so we've done the science, we've done the valuation. And the answer is this enough to convince humanity to look after nature? And the answer is no. Unfortunately, despite the science and despite the valuation, nature is still very much under threat. And I can spend a whole hour on this. If you look at all the reports, they don't look very good. My colleague right before me was talking about the sea rise. It's happening everywhere. Species are dying at a very fast rate. Okay, the oceans are at risk, land is at risk, and so forth. So how do we change this behavior? Science tells us it's important. We do this valuation, model valuation, and it tells us it's in dollar terms, yes, very important to our market system. What is missing in order to affect the change? What's missing is a policy action. Policy action is where the policymakers come around and say, okay, the evidence tells us it's important. Here's the value to our economy. And if we are convinced that what we need to do is do something about it. And doing something about it could be as simple as saying the whale is a national asset. If you do any harm to it, there's a penalty to it. Okay, this body of water, seagrass, salt marshes, mangroves, very important in terms of the fight against climate change. We're going to value it. We're going to declare it a national asset. And any harm done to it, there's a penalty. And we're going to monitor people's behavior around those assets. So that policy is needed. And I'll explain in a bit why it's needed. Okay, because when we act in this manner, when we set that framework, legal framework, okay, and provide also, sorry, this is my, so, all right, how did this happen? Okay, so, excuse me. So when we provide the legal rights and do the monitoring and provide the value, then the markets, then the other part of the society that is trying to figure out what's really going on start to take us seriously. All this profession of love for the ocean, and poems are written and songs are written, fine and dandy, but that's basically, you're having a conversation with the converts. There are the other part of the society that are unaware or may not even care for the intrinsic value of nature, that need to come on board. They have the resources. We need to speak that language. This is all moving in that direction. So let me give you an example of countries that have gone ahead and have done something towards nature. New Zealand is at the forefront of this action. What they've done, they've actually conferred personhood on their rivers. Imagine. So the rivers in New Zealand have the same rights as a human being, and we have responsibilities towards these rivers. And if any harm is done to a river, pollution or otherwise, there are criminal and monetary fines that are sort of exercised. Costa Rica, it's not here on this slide, but Costa Rica is another country that basically conferred personhood on bees, because they've realized how much they rely on bees for pollination. So they gave rights to bees. Basically, they're saying these are creatures that have, that they have the right to exist just like us. We have responsibilities towards them. These are examples of how we can start to move away just science, valuation, policy action, and assigning a monetary value to it. Only then can we talk about something called natural capital. I see many people talk about, they say this is natural capital, and I say you have to be careful. Something that is called capital needs two things. It needs to be an asset, meaning it has to be valuable in one form or another, and it needs to be codified in the law. Every asset that you and I know and we trade in the market, think of if you have investments in stocks and bonds. No one has ever met a stock or a bond. These things exist in the law. These are creatures of law. Okay, they don't exist physically, and they are in the law because it's the visible hand of the government that allowed them to exist. It's not the invisible hand of the market. Once the government says you can put this on your balance sheet, then the invisible hand of the market creates services around this, around the asset. So every asset that you and I know, except for physical asset, which is land, for example, stocks, bonds, mortgage-backed securities, all these things are assets on our balance sheets, but they only exist not because they also have value, because you're allowed to put them on the balance sheet due to the legal coding. So if we want to take what I just described to you, this new wealth, and put it on our balance sheets, we need the law. We need the policy action that will allow us to do so. Once it's codified in the law, it becomes financial capital, if you like, which then the markets will look at this and say, hey, wait a minute, this is a new class of assets. I can build services around it. But notice, these are services around a living nature, not services around a dead nature. So we can have insurance companies coming in to ensure that these assets continue to survive and they're protected, and all kinds of other types of businesses can arise in order to protect the asset. It also has many benefits by stabilizing communities in their land. All that money that comes in from the sale of ecosystem services, for example, carbon, we can sell the carbon of mangroves. We can sell the carbon of the seagrass. We can sell the carbon that is sequestered by the elephants or by the whales, just like we're doing it with the trees. And you sell the carbon, not the asset itself. The money comes in to protect the asset and to protect the local communities and indigenous population. Okay, so what I wanted to put for you here is, how do we do this? I'm a financial economist. I'm trying here to talk to my my what's in it for me crowd, the crowd that basically says, what's in it for me to come inside the tent. What we're trying to tell them is there's immense amount of wealth to be created by creating markets around a living planet, a living nature. But what we need from the supply side, we need to know what we have. We need to value what we have. We need to create the legal structures to protect it. And we need to monitor it and enforce penalties. If any harm is done to these assets, only then they become financial capital that can move on the balance sheet. That is the technology that's going to help the 37% free up the nature in order to suck up 37% of the carbon that is needed by the climate fight that's summarized in the Paris Accords. But I want to highlight one thing here, very important, which is when we sell the ecosystem services of nature, in this case, we're selling carbon offsets, we need to ensure two things, two principles, that the money that comes in will have to look after these assets or the elephants or the whales or the dolphins or the trees or in perpetuity. These are, in many cases, these are beings just like us, and they have the right to live long after their carbon capacity has been exhausted. So the money that comes in has to look after these assets in perpetuity. We have ethical, moral obligations towards them. And two, that money that comes in has to look after the local communities and the indigenous population in perpetuity through income and through employment. Of course, the local government would benefit because when the money comes in, it alleviates poverty. People have more money, they'll spend more money, they spend it on consuming all kinds of things, which expands the tax base, and the government's fiscal revenues would actually increase. Okay. So if you ask me, what's different now? Why weren't we talking about this 5 or 6 years ago? Because 5 or 6 years ago, the price of carbon in the market was zero. Why? Because few of us were talking about climate change, the scientists certainly, but not the rest of us. So the demand for carbon sequestration was almost zero. As a result, the price was zero. Today's price on the European exchange system is $73 per ton of carbon. The expectations is that those prices are going to go up into the hundreds by next year. So what's different is climate change is upon us. That's what's different. What's different is that the science is new science that's revealing the secrets of nature to us, telling us what a beautiful world we live in. What's also new is technology is new. It allows us now to identify even whales in the ocean. We can identify individual elephants in the forest. We did not have this technology, not even 2 years ago. So a lot of things are coming together that allow us to actually create this beautiful world that is all centered around nature, but it's predicated on one understanding, fundamental understanding, that the sustainability of our own existence very much depends on the sustainability of nature and its ecosystems and its biodiversity. Using that understanding, we can actually build markets around nature, around the ecosystem services of nature, and thereby then we can talk about prosperity that is shared and that is sustainable. Okay. And that's all I wanted to share with you, because I wanted to give space for questions. Just want to just read out to you what I've written here, but it's time for us to come home. Think of the prodigal son. I remember the Jesuits who raised me were like, what story of the prodigal son is about the father who, took the son back. I said, no, I remember, I was 15 years old. I raised my hand. I said, no, it's the son who realized he made a mistake and came back a different person. Came back more humble and wiser. We need to come home. We need to come home to the only home we will ever know. Carl Sagan used to say, the only home we've ever known. I would just tweak it a little, say the only home we will ever know. Okay. Nature has been looking after us for so many centuries and millennia, and it's time for us to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph Chami. What an a wonderful presentation, and it's time that we had economic presentations related to all we talk about nature. We have several comments between our group here, and I just have to say, as an Indigenous person, I'm a member of the Muskogee Nation, and we put a lot of shows on about Indigenous science and how our people have been at the forefront of this and are finally, people are learning the lessons, maybe not listening to Indigenous people. But when we looked at the Dakota Access Line project 2 years ago, people from all over the world came, and the message was, water is life, water is sacred, because without water, we have nothing. And I really appreciate the way you have put the life of these animals and their excretions as important for the rest of the world. Really, absolutely appreciate that, because, well, and you do mention Indigenous people many times, but listening to Indigenous people is more important today than ever, because we have been taught how to live with the land and how to keep everything fresh instead of being our own people sequestered and isolated. And as you said, being for your own background, being taught by other people that our languages and our knowledge was not relevant. It's more relevant than ever. So appreciate all of that. But we have tons of notes we want to get into. I'll stop talking about
We've been schooled here.
So Leanne, why don't you ask?
Oh, I just want to be your student is what I want to be. Oh my goodness. I tell you what, Earth tech and biodiversity, nature is saying I'm valuable. There are just so many phrases that you put together, how we rethink the economics of our oceans. And rethinking is by putting a value on those oceans, on the assets within that. They are assets within our oceans. The seagrass, the whales, and above ground, the elephants and the trees. But we were really impressed too about the amount of carbon that the whales consume again. Discuss that again, and if you would.
Sure. In fact, I just want to clarify one thing. Sometimes people tell me, are you putting a value on life? I said, no. It's just to think of it this way. I work for the IMF and they pay me a salary. I provide a service and they pay me a salary. The natural assets, we call them assets, unfortunately, whales, dolphins, what have you, all of them have been providing service to humanity for which they've been paid nothing. In fact, we've been killing them with impunity. We destroyed their homes. We harmed them individually. I mean, think about whaling. Whaling, we used to have 5 million whales and more. We were down to less than 1 million before we realized that we are about to drive whales to extinction. Whales are called a keystone species. When whales cease to exist, the oceans die. I discovered this. I went 4.5 years ago. I was on a research vessel and these guys were studying the blue whale in the Sea of Cortez. This is how I came upon this knowledge. My degree is in physics. My first degree is in physics, then statistics, then finance, then economics. And here I am sitting on the boat with a bunch of scientists, and I'm like, what are you guys talking about? What are you? And they were like, oh, this is well-known work. Andy Pershing is the father of all of this work. His paper is 2010. And then all these others were talking. And I said, how come we don't know this? How is it that these incredible creatures, look, we're all carbon units. We all capture carbon. But these are the great whales. I mean, let me give you an idea for your audience that may not know what a blue whale is. A blue whale, you can put in the mouth of a blue whale the largest elephant on land. It would disappear completely.
Wow.
That's a blue whale. Because I was with them for 4 years, I would go and study them every year. So a blue whale can swallow a complete elephant in her mouth, and that's it, just the mouth. We're not talking about the rest of the body. She can be 90 feet, 100 foot, 110, 120 foot long. But it's not only the length, it's the volume. And this incredible creature feeds next to you. Our boat was right next to those incredible, feeding right next to you. She knows that you're there. She's aware of your presence. She could easily, with one flip, throw us all into the ocean, but she chooses not to. If once you see that, it was on my bucket list. That's how I ended up on that incredible journey that changed my life. I'm sitting there looking at this blue whale thinking, my goodness, what is it that I'm looking at here? You can't help but realize how much you are missing from the full picture, the fullness of life, the fullness of this incredible world that we are in, this incredible gift that we've been given. And me being trained as a neoclassical economist, right? I was sitting with these scientists and whale conservationists and learning from them, and I'm thinking, how come I don't know this? What can I do to help them? So the only reason I did the valuation is to talk to my crowd. I grew up also in the Midwest. I want to talk to someone who's in Nebraska, who may never go to the ocean. I want to tell her or him, you ought to care about the whale because the whale is saving you. Even if you didn't care for the whale intrinsically, all life is priceless, all of life, small and big. But even if you just think of it, what's in it for me, right? These are my crowd. I'm a financial economist. I'm not going to use foul language on radio. There's another name for this crowd, but let's call it for now, what's in it for me crowd. You want to tell them, even if you don't care for the whale, this whale is saving you. So if you care for yourself, you should care for it. That's how we wrote these papers, is to talk to our crowd. And that's why we put a monetary value on their services, not on their life. All life is priceless. So just like I'm being paid a salary at the IMF, these whales should be paid the value of their product. They are saving us in terms of sequestering carbon. They increase fish stocks. And there's a multi-billion-dollar whale tourism that they get no penny out of it. You see? So what we're saying is pay them, or pay those that look after them. So these whales capture carbon on their body.
Yes.
Tremendous amount of carbon. And they're so heavy, when they die, they sink to the bottom. Now, the scientists will tell you, you don't need to hit the bottom for carbon to be sequestered. Anything below 200 meters does not interact with the atmosphere. So the carbon they call the word, it's capture and sequestration. Sequestration meaning when it does not interact with the atmosphere, meaning it remains carbon for a very, very long time. If it interacts with the atmosphere, it becomes carbon dioxide. So below 200 meters and all the way to the bottom of the ocean, sometimes below 1,000 meters, that carbon is there for centuries.
Ralph, we were
please.
reading too your article from 2019 talking
Yes.
about all of this, and that carbon sequestrian or so. Yeah. Anyway, so the excrement too, the
Yes.
that feeding the phytoplankton, which then feeds back
Exactly. Isn't that beautiful?
Which feeds them, and then but now the population has really dwindled. What is the percentage of what they used to be? The blue whale alone.
The blue whale have done far worse than others. Actually, if you want to think of all these whales, which is the species that is at most at risk is the right whale. The right whale is close to extinction, unfortunately. And the right whale is dying not because of climate change, it's because the fishermen, the lobster fishermen, they use this, if you like, this rope all the way down to the bottom where they put the cages. And what's happening is those. Remember. Let me step back a little. Whales communicate with each other through sound, because below 200 meters there's no light. It's all about sound. And before we created noise pollution for whales could communicate across a whole ocean with each other. That distance has shrunk due to the noise in the water. Okay, those air guns that we shoot in the water to find out where the oil is or the gas is destroys their eardrums, creates all kinds of problems for. That's why they beach themselves, because they get lost. They can't see and they can't hear, so they're lost.
Michael Stocker was talking about that.
Yes, of course. And so it's the noise pollution that's killing them. That's why I'm saying we're facing two risks, not only climate change. Everybody's focused on climate change, but Sir David Attenborough and Sylvia Earle And all of these wonderful people are telling you, watch out. There's a more imminent risk is the death of nature. And that alone will kill us. You can capture all the carbon that you want, but we're not going to be there. When the organic, when the system fails in the ocean, we die with it. And we need to change our behavior. And my mom was a professor, and she used to always tell me, Ralph, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We know enough to act. I don't want to hear any more songs about the ocean or poetry about the ocean. I write songs myself. I'm a musician. I don't want to write about, I want action. We need action. We have enough songs, we need action. We need to act now. And we know what we have to do. We know what to do.
I'm going to jump in for a second. I mean, we are all obviously agreeing with you, and this past week, and we've got one more day talking a lot about all of these issues. I think you're putting it in these terms, like one whale is equivalent to thousands of trees. We haven't heard that before. I think yesterday or the day before, we did a show on the importance of phytoplankton, and Scott and Tree understand that completely.
And the right whale too.
And the right whales. But the thing, when you say taking action, I think what none of us have talked about is electing leadership. Leadership in our nation where people who are not external to nature, who are not being paid by coal companies and oil companies, extractive companies to stop forward movement or deny climate change, that's going to make the difference right now. And I can only address the United States and what's going on here. I mean, they don't even want to pay for family leave for humans. So humans are not considered important either to many people in our government. So, I mean, we have to make that change as well. And who's going to be making those decisions on our behalf, not allegedly on our behalf, but on our behalf. And I'm, that's got to be the next battle, because that's where so many allocations are made for the humans who are living here in in the United States and other governments.
I see my job as bringing the good news. See, you can tell people, I was raised by the Jesuits, and I remember all these things. You see, you're only held accountable when you see the light and you walk away from it. I see my job and job of others is to bring the news that I didn't know myself. I mean, I thought I was an educated person until 4 years ago. I realized you knew nothing about the ocean. You see, when I found out that what the ocean is doing for us, then you can hold people accountable. So I thought part of writing the 2019 piece and the other pieces that we've written since, and we continue to, is to say, look, the science, this is not me, this is the science telling us nature is valuable, which indigenous populations already knew. I am sorry to tell you that we're coming full circle back to the indigenous population. Hopefully not too late to say, how did you do this? Imagine I presented with a tribal chief a year ago, and we both agreed. And the moderator said, when the IMF agrees with the tribal chief, there's hope for humanity.
Yes.
Because he said something really beautiful. He said, we learned, he was talking about his tribe, to walk the earth softly. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was incredible, so beautiful, is to walk. So that's what I'm trying to do in my work, using my own language, is to say, we can build markets. It's not, by the way, conservation. It used to be either conservation or profits. This is completely different. This new paradigm says, no, conservation is profitable, because what we can do is pay nature for its services. That money, and in this case, just carbon, because everybody's now about carbon. So we can sell carbon offsets from our mangroves, salt marshes, seagrass, not only our trees, from elephants and whales, not the assets themselves. You never sell the whale, you never touch the whale, never touch the asset. It has to be free to do what it's supposed to do.
It's services.
Exactly. The services come, the money comes in. So who gets the service? Let's say Microsoft wants to offset its carbon footprint. Let's just say for a minute, okay? So what you can say to Microsoft is, why don't you partner with me? Partner with me rather than be a consumer. Partner with me in Mother Nature. How much do you need to offset? 100 tons a year? Fine. Here, You give me the money for the 100 tons, and I will assign, let's say we're talking about elephants, so that people don't say just the ocean. I'll assign 4 elephants who are frolicking in the forest free to do the service for you, because each elephant captures about 22 tons. We're going to call them Ralph, Grace, Charles, and Claude. These are the names of my siblings.
Oh,
You can track them in real terms, in real time. And that money comes in on 2 conditions: to look after those elephants in perpetuity, and to look after the stewards of them, who are the local community and the indigenous people. Now look how beautiful that is. Microsoft gets to offset its carbon. Microsoft gets to put on its website that it's helping to save the elephants of Gabon. Microsoft gets to say that it's alleviating poverty. Microsoft gets to hit all the SDGs. How much is that worth to Microsoft? A lot of money. But in return, the local communities get first of all, a better nature, better environment. They understand that a living nature is the source of their health and their wealth. Nature gets to thrive. The local government gets an increase in the tax base because people have more money. Money is flowing in. So the tax, through the tax or fees, whatever. So what I'm describing to you is a really new paradigm that we've developed. And it's all it takes is the action is at the policy level to recognize nature for what it is. I don't want to hear anything about, oh, we have marine protected areas. I'm like, what does that mean? What does it mean, really? It's like me telling you I'm your best friend, and then somebody, 2 goons happen upon you, and I look the other way. That's not your friend. If we care about something, you have to declare it that it's valuable to you, and you have to assign a monetary value.
and legal. Make it
And
legal.
legal, absolutely. I used to teach corporate finance for many years. I was a professor at University of Notre Dame in the business school. And I would, every instrument that I taught my students, I used to tell them it's codified in the law. You see, that's what we don't tell our students, because we tell them it's the invisible hand. That's not true. The first action is a visible hand of the government. You know why a mortgage-backed security exists? Because the government allows it to exist. It allows the lawyer to mint it into the law.
I went to business school.
There you go. Every instrument that every financial instrument that you know is minted in the law. When it's minted in the law, it's endowed with 4 characteristics. Priority, that means who owns it. Durability, that means you own it in time. Okay. Universality, that means your rights are respected across land. And convertibility, that means you can convert that claim into the legal tender of the United States.
Like real estate.
Exactly. So that's why these assets suddenly, you can put them on the balance sheet, and then they get insured. They get all kinds of services. So if you really want to protect nature, we need the legal action. Once you have the legal action and you attach the monetary value to it, to its cash flows, then the markets take you seriously. Otherwise, we're just talk.
Well, I have a question to follow up on that. Obviously, we're all enthralled and glad that you are there,
Yes.
and you're.
I'm honored that you asked me to.
Are helping make these changes. But are you finding more people coming inside the tent? I mean,
Oh,
obviously
yes.
you're already in the tent. So how,
Oh, yeah.
are people wanting to get in the tent?
Those
Oh,
policies.
yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. To the point that I had to take sabbatical from my own organization. I took leave from the IMF in order to dedicate all of my time to this work, because I was inundated with requests from sovereigns, from foundations, from investors. Imagine, investors are now saying, how can I invest? See, they need help. How do I invest? Sovereigns, you know what this means? This means you can go to poor countries and say, stop killing your nature. Your nature, your living nature is incredibly valuable for you. And you can sell the services of your nature, not sell your nature, not cut down your trees, not dig, not extract, leave it alive and well. It's far more valuable for you, for your people, in terms of their health and in terms of your wealth. that's why the demand now for this new paradigm is so much so that I haven't had vacation. It's my choice for the past 4.5 years, literally. Because it was a hobby of mine when I was at the IMF. I was doing it just to help the scientists with the whales. That's how it started. And then a scientist, Fabio Berzaghi, called me from Paris. He said, "Hey, Ralph, you valid those whales. Can you help me? Because the elephants are dying. No one is listening. We used to have 1.5 million forest elephants. We're down to 90,000. IUCN says in the next decade, there'll be no forest elephants left. Can you help me? Can you help me value them?" So our team worked with Fabio Berzaghi, and we came up with the valuation of a lifetime of a work of one elephant. Just imagine, just in carbon, although those elephants do a lot more, just in carbon is it's $2 million minimum. That's her salary for helping us continue to live. That's the payment that we ought to be paying her. And then what happens after that, the floodgates opened up. I got requests from all over asking me, "Can you help us value nature?" And I say, "Listen, I'm helping you value the services of nature."
Yes.
As not nature, not sanctity of life, please. Okay, but it's a language that our society, unfortunately, is the only language they speak. You only have a voice if you have a price.
He's retraining the brains to
Yes.
think differently.
Yes.
That's what you're helping all these.
Yes. And moving from an extractive view of nature to a regenerative view of nature.
Ralph, I
Yes, please.
a few years ago to the Galapagos and Ecuador. And when you talk about the value of tourism, and those 12 days I was on that island, they preach that. And they really respect that. And, looking at the carbon as well, but looking at what they're giving the world is incredible. And it's priceless, but it does have a price. And it does bring in economics to a country that is somewhat kind of poor.
Exactly. And what you can do for countries such as Ecuador is this paradigm says, if you're unable to attract the tourists for whatever reason, during COVID, for example, tourism dried up, you can still sell the carbon services of your nature. You see, it gives you that sense of independence. So the tourist dollars become an additional cash flow to the cash flow coming from the sale of the services of nature. Right now, it's free. We're giving it for free, and nature is not infinite. That was the mistake we made. We dumped everything in the ocean because we are land-based mammals. We can hardly understand the land, let alone the ocean and its vastness. Let me give you a statistic that I spent last 2 weeks in France with a bunch of ocean scientists. Let me tell you what they taught me. The open ocean, which belongs to everybody, has been capturing since 1830 and today has captured over 440 gigatons of carbon due to human activity. That's the open ocean just sucking in because it's a huge carbon sink. Imagine this is a gift of nature to humanity. If you want to put a price tag to it so that it crystallizes in your head, multiply it by $50. 50 times 440 gigatons, you're talking about over $2 trillion. Gift of the ocean to all of humanity. You see, and the reason I'm giving you this, because once you see the dollar amount and you realize this is only in carbon, we're not even talking about other services that the ocean provides. It's only to force the hand of the policymakers to take action, because that's the language that they speak. People always tell me, you shouldn't do in dollars and cents. I said, yeah, I'd like to be paid by different than dollars, but how do I eat? This is I cannot eat with thank yous. I wish,
Scott,
maybe, yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry, I wanted, Scott, you've been sitting there quietly. Scott Mercer, who's one of the founders of this Ocean Life Symposium that we're in our 3rd year. What do you think about what Ralph has been sharing with us?
It was just a dizzying amount of information. you said the word enthralled. That's how I've been sitting here with both Ralph and Suzanne earlier. But Ralph, you're talking about, the what's in it for me and so forth, and the value. Ecotourism actually started because of where the saving the habitat and the animals instead of hunting or harvesting and cutting down trees was actually more valuable than taking the animal itself, and actually using people who had hunted the animals as guides to lead guided tours into areas where people were, the animal was still there the next day, and so was the forest, to be used again. And it was more valuable to population that was using this to exploit than it was to exploit. And we're seeing this sort of the inverse of this in the Gulf of Maine right now, where the Gulf of Maine is warming up so quickly that it's actually cutting down on the amount of phytoplankton as water warms, which is taking in less carbon, giving off less oxygen. And we have plankton populations moving into other areas, and the food chain following that, like the right whales moving from the Gulf of Maine, sadly, up into the Canadian Maritimes, where they, as you know, there's been collisions with both ships and gear. And we're trying to get across to the congressional delegation that instead of being negative about changes in gear, that the climate change is actually the big problem, and that's what's going to impact fisheries, the lobstering industry, and so forth. That's the big umbrella problem over this whole thing. It's not changing the gear that's the problem. It's the climate change and the warming of the waters. We're already hearing that lobsters in southern New England are reaching their thermal threshold now and moving out of that area. So thank you for bringing all that up to us about the What's in It for Me crowd and how to remedy this from your standpoint in economics. It must have been interesting being trapped on a ship with Andy Purdy all that time. I can't imagine what a privilege that would be. So thank you, Ralph.
Thank you very much. The financial sector has tremendous resources. And what's different today than, say, 5 or 6 years, even 10 years ago, is that the investors are truly trying to engage, saying, okay, I recognize we are facing calamity together. What can I do? It's incumbent on us to tell them how that money should be channeled in the right direction. What worries me about the discussion on climate change is if we sell them only the high tech, which is, I understand the allure of the high tech, but imagine a high tech where, imagine you had this big thing that grabs all of the carbon. It's not going to stop us from dying, because when the oceans die, we die.
Hey,
when the forests die, we die.
Do that. You remember the one movie that they had Star Trek and Captain Kirk goes back into the past to San Francisco.
I love that one.
Whales and takes it back to the future.
Gene Roddenberry, I'm not sure whether he came up with that one, but certainly he was a visionary.
Well, we are hoping that, we have devoted 3 hours of our programming this week to every kind of issue that every day that Scott and Tree have pulled together. A lot of ocean scientists and also Suzanne Russ, people like yourself, to talk about it. We are lucky. We live right at the ocean. We can see what's happening. We have a lot of friends who are scientists or working in other places to try and help change them, bring more people into the tent, trying to be positive.
Look, we're all tied together in a belt of humanity.
Mm-hmm. And
no one can escape this. It's called, Sagan said it a long time ago in his beautiful essay on the pale blue dot. He said, this is the only planet we will ever know. We've only known. I mean, this is it. I don't care where you shoot yourself up into, and then come down. You have to come down. so we have to hold hands and sing Kumbaya together and tread water together. We are all in it together.
I love the phrase Earth Tech.
Yes.
High tech, but Earth Tech.
Yes. This is my colleague. I have to, she's going to be embarrassed, Dinah Nieberg, who came up with it. We were talking about Earth tech versus nature, and she said sorry, we were talking about high tech versus what nature, and she said it's really Earth tech, Ralph. I love that.
How can we talk, of course, we're talking with us, we're talking with the people in our audience, primarily rural people, but we do have, global reach as well. How do we get the everyday person to really get involved in this on whatever level they can, but also to have influence on the change makers themselves? I think a lot of people feel like, but what can I do about this? I'm just, I'm just Peggy living here in Walla. What difference is that going to make?
Well, part of the message, you're absolutely right. So part of the message is to say, I lived in Kansas, and I lived in Illinois, and I lived in Indiana, and I had wonderful years in the Midwest. That part of this message is for people who don't live next to the ocean, and say the ocean is helping us survive. It's not about the ocean, really. It's about us. It's called enlightened self-interest, if you would like. and there's nothing wrong with it if it ends up that it's good for everybody. Okay. I remember when I was reading Levi Strauss a long time ago, and he talks about Santa Claus. He said, even the greatest giver of all has conditions for giving you a gift, right? We sing it at Christmas. He sees if you're sleeping. He knows if you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. So nothing is for free, not even with Santa Claus. There are conditions for gifts. The condition here is we need to look after our only home. We have no place else to go. The presumption that somehow you can kill and maim with impunity is predicated on a false. If I had time, we'd get into the history of it, because I've spent a lot of time studying that. Francis Bacon says we're endowed with nature with infinite commodities. Who told him that? Where'd he get that from? We're not. Nature is not infinite. And it doesn't have a zero price.
So we need to get it codified in the law, right?
Yes, we need the policymaker. If they tell you we care about nature, you tell them, codify it in the law. Do what New Zealand is doing. Do what other countries, Costa Rica is doing. If you care about those whales, they ought to be called a national asset. And there's a value. You have to attach value to it, because you see, I know we're running out of time. Let me just tell you something. Suppose we do the following. Suppose we declare all water around the US marine protected area. Okay? Just to make that declaration. Now I am captain of a ship, and I've been stuck in the Suez Canal for seven weeks, because those guys can move that big ship until they figure out how to do it. I'm late to the port of Los Angeles. I'm paying money on daily basis, right, as a fine so you tell me there's a whale in my way. Do you think I'm going to stop?
Cheers.
I'll tell you the answer, no. Even if it's a marine protected. Why? Because I'm going to say to myself, yeah, I'm a nice guy, but if I hit that whale, what's the penalty?
That's right.
Zero. So you want to change his behavior, the captain's behavior, you declare it a national asset, and you attach a value to it. You hit that whale, you're going to pay us $3 million, because Chami and his colleagues valued it. Now, that's only the beginning of the game, because guess what happens next if we're to do something like that? Lloyd's of London that insures that ship, what do you think they're going to do? They're going to look at that contract and they say, hey, come here, man. When we insured your ship, we didn't realize there was an asset in the water that is worth $3 million. So we're going to put an addendum that says you are not insured against hitting a whale. It's on you. So now the captain is in the water thinking, oh my goodness, if I hit that whale. But wait, we don't want to punish the guy. We want to bring him into the tent, right? So the owner of the tanker is going to say, is there some kind of technology that would keep the whale away from my ship?
And I found it so interesting. Personhood of birds and bees.
Yes. Yes.
Well, well, to be redundant, we've been saying that for centuries.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. These are beings that have a. I mean, when you study the whales that I did, it's incredible. I mean, they have history like us. They have families. They have structure. They have everything. So all we're doing here in this new paradigm is recognizing it as such, and rebuilding our economy such that nature is not an afterthought. Nature is part and parcel of the decision to conduct our business.
And
Nature is our partner. And I'll end it here.
yes, that's a great place to end on.
Thank you so much. And
Yes, thank you.
we would love to have you back on.
I would be honored to be back.
Actually, you should do a whole series, frankly, but
Same here.
to help as we're moving into next generations and changing people's ways of thinking that are now open to that. So thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
your
Thank you for your time.
enjoyed
Thanks
it.
to everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now. Thank you, Scott. Bye-bye.
Chami of the International Monetary Fund, thank you so much.
Thanks.
And you are listening to KGUA in Wallala 88.3 FM. We are live online at kgua.org, and we're live on YouTube. You'll be able to watch this entire series at any time. You can cast it to your TV. You can play it in your car. It is going to be an evergreen type series here. This is an excellent platform that we've got, and we've been bringing you all these experts in ocean, experts, and also citizen scientists as well. And you can find the schedule, the full schedule on our website. Just go to schedule at the top of the page, and you'll have an interactive, live, automated system that'll tell you what's up next and what their background is, what the title of the talk is. And that'll be on the website as well as on our Air Pocket app, which is in the upper left-hand corner when you click listen live. I'm Leanne Lindsay. This is Peggy Berryhill and Paul Mundy. We are some of your hosts. Also, there's George Callis, who's going to be coming back with us tomorrow. And we've got Roberta Chan and also Jean Barry in the background doing work every day. We thank all of the people who are involved and our sponsors. We've got many sponsors. I'll just say a few real quick, and that's the Sea Ranch Supply, CNA Metalworks, the Sea Ranch Lodge, Linden Design Gallery, Lisberg and Company Realtors, and the Anchor Bay Thai Kitchen and Surf Market. Did I miss anybody?
I don't think you did. And I just
got
want to say is, the manager of the station and the organization Native Media Resource Center, we are so honored and so proud to work with Scott and Tree Mercer for bringing you
Yes.
this Ocean Life
Thank you.
Symposium for 3 years in a row. We are committed, obviously, to all life matters. We all live here at the ocean. We can appreciate this. And I want to thank our audience for indulging us as we have taken over this 9 to 12 this week. We've got one more day. We put our regular programming aside to make sure that we could bring you all these wonderful voices, including the next voice that Paul is going to tell us about coming up on the Ocean Life Symposium. And you may have more questions. You can send your questions and comments to Ocean Life Symposium. That's all one long word, Ocean Life Symposium @gmail.com. And we will try and get your questions answered. Thank you.
Well, I'm very excited to introduce Victoria Knoll. She brings with us an update of the marine life entanglements in Dungeon crab gear, a fishery management perspective. Victoria also is part of the Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife. Victoria began her career in marine science 12 years ago, collecting samples and monitoring the local impacts of our oceans. Victoria, I'm so excited to have you here today. Thank you.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm going to share my screen because I've got some stuff to show. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me on today. It's a pleasure speaking with you all and really appreciate this opportunity to learn from colleagues as well. So I am a coastal crab fishery biologist for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, or WDFW. WDFW has management authority over the Dungeness crab fishery that occurs within state and offshore waters of Washington. So I work primarily with the coastal fishery as opposed to the one in Puget Sound. And my work focuses on addressing marine life entanglements from this fishery management perspective. So first, I'd like to talk about the issue of marine life entanglements, and then what we've done so far to address it, and what we're going to do to continue the work, and some upcoming challenges and ways that you can engage. So in recent years, there's been an increase in marine life entanglements off the US West Coast. Now, this graph that I'm showing shows only whale entanglements, but you may notice I often will say marine life entanglements. And this is because the most common reports we get off the West Coast are of large whales, particularly baleen whales. But it's easy to forget, especially in Washington, we also have several species of sea turtles in our waters. They spend most of their time here feeding at the shelf break, which is pretty far offshore in Washington, farther than most people venture out. So they don't get sighted very often, but they are critically endangered and they can become entangled in crab fishing gear. So while we don't know much about how or how often that occurs, we are cognizant of their presence and vulnerability. And we take it into account when we plan and implement actions to reduce risk of marine life entanglements. So a few things jump out when we take a look at this visual. This is confirmed entanglement reports by year from 2000 to 2020. And from 2000 to about 2013, you'll see it's about an average of 10 entanglements per year. Then in 2015, we started to see a big spike, and there are multiple factors that likely contributed to this. So first, I'll note that the process for entanglement reporting and verification or confirmation was really more ad hoc prior to about 2013. So it was really once we started to see a spike in entanglements that we also started to see a more systematic way of documenting them. So that's sort of a footnote, but it contributes to our understanding of this time period as what I and folks are calling the modern era of entanglements. So beyond that, we'll also notice here that the spike in entanglements was largely driven by humpback whales. So a few things about that. There's been some recent studies to get to the bottom of what happened in 2015, what's driving that spike in entanglements, particularly in humpback whales. Humpback whales have been recovering since federal protections were put in place. So simply put, there are just more whales. But also during this time, we also saw humpback whales exhibit prey switching behavior. So this has been attributed to the blob marine heat wave, which brought difficult conditions for krill. So krill didn't do well. Humpback whales likely weren't getting enough food from those kind of meager krill aggregations, and they came more inshore to feed on anchovy. Unfortunately, this put them in closer proximity spatially with the Dungeness crab fishery. It's the largest fixed gear fishery on the coast by landings, by number of fishers, by economic value, and by amount of gear that is used to fish with. On top of that, a harmful algal bloom event occurred off the coast of California coinciding with this that delayed the fishery opening significantly. So normally the fishery starts in November, December, and runs until the following July, August, or September, depending on the state. And it slows down a lot by the time the summer rolls around. So in 2015, the fishery in California didn't open until late in the spring, which coincided with the seasonal arrival of humpbacks on their migration and reaching their feeding grounds for the summer. So there was this unprecedented amount of spatial and temporal overlap of whales and crab fishing gear. We just worked through a significant harmful algal bloom event in Washington, like the one that delayed California's fishery during this time. And in order to avoid a similar situation, we opened the fishery under evisceration requirements to avoid extending the delay into the spring when whales are more common off the coast. And evisceration just means we required the viscera or the guts to be removed before the crab can be processed or brought to market. And that those guts is where a lot of the toxins are stored during harmful algal blooms. So the marine heat wave and HABs, harmful algal blooms generally, affect the entire coast, but this spike looks a little different in Washington than it does from a coast-wide perspective. So I'm going to get into that. West Coast entanglements started increasing in 2014, peaking in 2015 and 2016. And many of those early entanglements were actually associated with California fisheries. So this slide focuses in on entanglements in Washington Dungeness crab fishery gear, where increases were largely not observed until 2017 and 2018. And this image has not been updated to include 2020, but I can say last year saw only one confirmed entanglement in Washington Dungeness crab gear. That was with a gray whale, no humpback whale entanglements. So for those of you who only have audio, we're looking at a total of 11 confirmed entanglements in Washington Dungeness crab gear, total over this recent time period, 2013 to present. And more specifically, no entanglements in 2013 or 2014. The first one is in 2015 with a humpback whale. Then we have none in 2016, 3 in 2017, one with a gray whale and 2 humpbacks. 5 in 2018, 2 humpbacks and 3 gray whales. And then 2019, there was 1 humpback. And 2020, as I mentioned, 1 gray whale, no humpbacks. So because some populations of humpback whales that occur off Washington's coast are ESA listed, takes of humpback whales must be authorized under both the ESA and MMPA. So that's Endangered Species Act and Marine Mammal Protection Act. Once we started to see a similar spike in entanglements off Washington as off California, we indicated to NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, our intent to apply for an incidental take permit, or ITP, under Section 10 of the ESA, so that our fishery can be in compliance with both federal regulations. So Section 10 of the ESA is reserved for state actions that have the potential to take ESA-listed species. So WDFW, as a state entity and manager of the fishery, must apply to NMFS through this process. An ITP, incidental take permit, has never before been issued for ESA-listed marine mammals. So what we do and don't do and how we do things could have ramifications on the national scale for fishery permitting. So other states, for example, on the East Coast are watching closely what happens next and how we navigate our situation. Now, developing a conservation plan, or a CP, is the first step in this process for applying for a permit. It lays the foundational rationale for applying for a permit and considerations for issuance. So this is a long process. It's estimated to take 3 to 5 years. And we've been closely coordinated with other West Coast managers in Oregon and California, and with NIMFs. This includes periodic check-ins as well as continual discussion and opportunities for feedback. So while we started drafting the CP in 2020 and late 2019, our response to increased entanglements in terms of taking actions to address the issue began immediately. So our first step was to learn more about the issue. With funding and coordination provided by the Pacific States Marine Fisheries Commission through a federal grant, a Washington Whale Entanglement Working Group was established in the fall of 2017. And WDFW staff and members of that Washington Whale Entanglement Working Group attended 2 entanglement workshops hosted by NOAA to learn more about the science of entanglements. WDFW staff, tribal representatives, and industry stakeholders spent much of 2018 in monthly meetings, learning about whale migration patterns, entanglement science, and gear options. The Washington Whale Entanglement Working Group provided a forum to better understand the issue from a Washington perspective, which led to the development of a best practices guide for the Washington coastal crab fishery. The following spring of 2019, WDFW staff began working with NIMFs and with the Oregon and California Departments of Fish and Wildlife to understand the process for securing an ITP. Simultaneously, we began working with stakeholders and our Fish and Wildlife Commission to develop and implement regulations to immediately reduce the risk of entanglements. Within that, we implemented an emergency rule in the summer of 2019 to reduce the number of pots allowed, and followed up with permanent rulemaking that was implemented in 2020 to this effect. In the fall of 2019, that's when we started the process to develop the CP. So in 2020, we really put pen to paper, started drafting the conservation plan. Our Fish and Wildlife Commission decided in favor of permanent regulatory changes that WDFW staff proposed to reduce the risk of entanglements. And we attended a West Coast entanglement science workshop where, alongside our partners in Oregon and California, we received a status update on recent entanglements in the ongoing investigations. We received a status update on recent developments in the ongoing investigations into the forensics of entanglements. So this year, we've continued drafting and revising our CP. We underwent additional rulemaking to improve fishery accountability and reduce entanglement risk further. And I'll talk about what all was in these rule packages in terms of conservation measures in just a bit. We started to ramp up our coordination this year with NIMFS's Northwest Fisheries Science Center to better understand entanglement risk specific to Washington, using our fishery logbook data and looking at the footprint of our fishery off Washington with more granularity. WDFW has always taken a management approach to the crab fishery that aligns with the agency's overall mission to provide harvest opportunities in a way that preserves and protects the resource and in a way that minimizes harm to other species and habitats. So for example, we require escape mechanisms on fishery pots so that if a pot is lost, a fisher can't return to it. the crab can still escape. It doesn't continue ghost fishing. We implemented a summer fishery management plan that protects soft-shelled crab, which are particularly vulnerable to handling mortality. And we have a robust derelict gear recovery program, which I'll talk about a little bit more later too. So everything we do is with this mission in mind, harvest opportunities and conservation. So the development of our conservation plan is no different. What I'm showing you here is what's included in our draft conservation plan from a high level perspective. And the terms that I've used and underlined here are terms from federal rules and guidance on what elements need to be in a completed CP. So you'll see these terms come up throughout the rest of my talk as I walk us through how we're addressing these pieces. Our CP describes our fishery and the impact it may have on protected species. It also includes a description of measures that monitor and reduce entanglement impacts, a plan for the implementation of those measures, and sufficient funding to support them throughout the permit period. It also includes a description of procedures to deal with unforeseen circumstances and remain in compliance with the terms of the permit. And it includes a description of alternative actions that we considered that would not result in take. And take, I've mentioned a couple of times, it's defined in federal regulations for the purposes of the ESA and MMPA, but essentially means to hurt, harass, seriously injure, or kill an animal protected under one or both of those laws. Okay, so more detail about our conservation plan. I'm going to go a little bit section by section. There's 8 total sections. The first one is just an introduction and states a purpose and need. Section 2 is where we describe our fishery. Section 3 is where we describe the environment in which the fishery takes place. And we describe the species that we're seeking permit coverage for. Section 4 is where we estimate the anticipated impacts that our fishery may have on those protected species that we're seeking for permit coverage. Section 5 is the heart of the conservation plan. And I'll talk about all the elements that are included in there in just a bit. Section 6 is plan implementation. So that includes an amendment process for proposed changes to the CP or the permit. Section 7 is funding sources and assurances. So WDFW will need to provide the funding sources and assurances that, that those sources will be in place for the duration of the permit. So this includes costs associated with implementing the CP, conservation strategies, so measures that we implement, monitoring measures, and reporting, and then adaptive management measures, which I'll talk about in a bit. All of those need to be accounted for in our description of funding sources and assurances. Section 8 is alternative actions. So that refers to the options other than the take of the species sought for coverage, so covered species. And so an example of this would be a complete closure of the fishery. So considered, but not chosen for adoption because it does not align with our agency's mission and legislative mandate. So the Washington fishery, we're looking at Washington coastal commercial Dungeness crab fishery. And this is the basics for the permit. We're requesting coverage for entanglements in that fishery for a period of 20 years and for the species listed on here. So humpback whales, blue whales, and leatherback turtles. The Washington fishery does not have a recorded history of entangling blue whales or leatherback sea turtles, but they are more cryptic species, so there's fewer of them, and they're sighted less frequently because they typically are farther offshore and or just shy. They have still been entangled in other Dungeness crab gear off the West Coast, so we do need to seek coverage for them because our fishery still has the potential to entangle them. You'll probably notice that gray whales are not on this list. And as I mentioned, the fishery does have a history of entangling gray whales. They are not ESA listed, so it's not really appropriate to seek permit coverage for them under Section 10 of the ESA, the way we're doing for these other species. That certainly does not mean that we ignore them, though. They are discussed in detail in our draft CP. They've been considered during the development of entanglement risk reduction measures, and our draft CP still includes an estimate of anticipated impacts to gray whale populations, even though this is not required. It's important for transparency and to keep us accountable. And the structure and vulnerability of populations of gray whales that are found off the West Coast are still an active area of research and monitoring. So with all that in mind, mostly want to stress for listeners that all the measures that we have implemented and will implement for our conservation plan will benefit gray whales in terms of entanglement risk reduction, just as they will also benefit the species on this list. So describing the fishery, it's considered the most economically significant commercial fishery off the Washington coast. So what you see here is an average ex-vessel value of about $43 million. And what's shown here is 2019 data specifically, but 2020 was the highest value season on record, exceeding $50 million.
And Victoria, I'm just going to step in here for a moment. Could you describe what to our radio listeners that the YouTube viewers are seeing? It's a pie chart. So could you describe that a little bit?
Yes, thank you. It's a pie chart of the coastal commercial fisheries in Washington and their economic value as a function of absolute value of dollars, ex-vessel value, and percent of the whole value of coastal commercial fisheries. So Dungeness crab is in green, and it shows a percentage of 56.69% of all fisheries. And something that's interesting also is salmon get a lot of airtime, and they are included in this less than 1% sliver in dark blue, and they're lumped in with other finfish. So in terms of coastal commercial fisheries, Dungeness crab is very important for our vulnerable coastal communities. These communities are heavily reliant on the crab fishery socioeconomically. It's the bread and butter of fishing communities. And it plays an important role in sustaining traditions and social cohesion. So our fishery is also co-managed with 4 coastal treaty tribes in the area north of Point Chehalis, which is near Gray's Harbor. So for those of you who can see this next visual and are maybe not familiar with our coastline, that's about where the marker on the right says Westport. So north of that, it's co-managed with those treaty tribes. Our conservation plan, it's important to note, only covers the state fishery because it falls under Section 10 of the ESA, the section about state activities. On the left here, we see a map of estimated humpback whale density, with the highest density areas occurring off the northern end of the coast. And that's been identified as a biologically important feeding area for humpbacks. And on the right, we see a heat map of crab fishing effort, where it's clear that most of the effort clearly occurs on the southern end of our coast. So these maps are just the beginning, really. And it's important to note that looking ahead, this is an area that we're working with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center on to build on current knowledge about the timing and areas where whales are off the Washington coast, and how co-occurrence of whales and crab gear can be modeled. So maybe in the future, we can even have a more dynamic tool we can use, as opposed to the sort of static hindcasts shown here. So it's an area of active research and collaboration. Pretty exciting. Okay. This is what the fishery generally looks like each season. On the x-axis is time, the months of a fishing season, and on the y-axis is the estimated number of lines in the water. It's a single pot fishery, so the number of pots is equal to the number of vertical lines in the water. And you can see the seasonality of landings and participation, which generally declines as the season progresses, starts high and declines. It's a clear and consistent trend for derby fisheries like Dungeness crab. Derby fishery often has a negative connotation, but there are harvest controls in place to ensure the sustainability of the fishery and the resource. Like a lot of other crustacean fisheries around the world, Dungeness crab is managed via a 3S system, so size, sex, and season. Harvested crab must be a minimum size to be retained, and they must be male. So these measures protect the reproductive capacity of the stock and allows the harvestable biomass to be replenished each year. And the season, as I mentioned, typically gets underway between November and January, depending on the state, or so December and January in Washington specifically. And in Washington, it ends on September 15th each year. The fishery is closed during the primary molting period, so between September and the opening of the following season. And this is to reduce handling mortality of softshell crab, which have low meat quality and are important for recruiting up into harvestable size classes. So that's the 3S system as it relates to Dungeness crab, and management of the coastal crab fishery, including and often beyond the 3S basics, is done in coordination with the Oregon and California Departments of Fish and Wildlife, who also manage their state Dungeness crab fisheries out to 200 nautical miles. We do this in a tri-state committee that's convened on a regular basis. So we have very good close coordination with those other states. And we have a long history of fishery data from fish receiving tickets that reports pots used over time. License holders can fish up to 300 or 500 pots each in Washington. So the representation here is an estimated maximum based on the assumption that each fisher participating in a given month is fishing their entire complement of pots. So there's degrees of uncertainty, but it is certainly an overestimation. So information on changing effort over the course of a season and between seasons is really valuable for management purposes. Now into a description of the environment. The environment off the Washington coast is highly dynamic. Environmental changes can have strong influence on the abundance and distribution of marine organisms, which can then influence estimates of entanglement risk, as we've seen. So folks might be familiar with El Nino and La Nina cycles in the California current system, and those are not new. However, we are seeing more marine heat waves like the blob, which I talked about earlier. And we're moving into an era of increasing and accelerating ocean warming and acidification associated with climate change. It's likely that what we're seeing and experiencing is actually a regime shift. So we'll be experiencing more frequent and more intense marine heat waves and harmful algal blooms on top of that baseline warming and acidification that we're seeing and expecting more of. Okay, this is a preliminary estimate of anticipated take for an incidental take permit. And it goes by species, and we have annual take estimates as well as totals for the 20-year permit. So for humpback whales, we have an anticipated annual take of 1.73, or about 2 animals per year, which comes up to 40 animals for a 20-year permit. Blue whales, 0.2 per year, or about 1 animal every 5 years, which would be 4 animals for the full permit. And Pacific leatherback sea turtles would be 0.1 per year, or about 1 animal every 10 years, approximately 2 animals. So these estimates are based on the recent entanglement record, and it's conservative. So I accounted for uncertainty associated with unidentified gear cases. So entanglement cases where the gear that's on the animal cannot be identified to the level of the fishery. And I also took into account cases where the whale could not be identified to a species level. So conservative estimate. And I will note too, most humpbacks off Washington, and this is specific to Washington, are from the Hawaiian population, which is actually delisted. It's not ESA listed. They are protected under the MMPA alongside all other marine mammals, but again, not ESA listed. So this is important when thinking about what a requested take of 40 animals means over the course of 20 years, and what it means specifically in terms of ESA listed animals and a permit issued under the ESA. So we're working to better understand this and new stock assessment information relative to our anticipated take. Humpbacks specifically are undergoing extensive review of their stock structure as it relates to the MMPA and ESA. So the future is a bit uncertain in regulatory terms as well at this point. I will note we have not had more than 2 humpback entanglements attributed to our fishery in a single year. So again, it's a conservative estimate. And I will mention again, we have no recorded entanglements of blue whales or leatherback turtles attributed to our fishery. The conservation program is the big section within the conservation plan, and it includes these elements that I showed earlier, but didn't get into detail on. And I'll get into more detail on each of these in just a moment, but broadly, it includes goals and objectives for the plan, conservation measures, so measures implemented to achieve those goals and objectives and to reduce risk of entanglements. It includes monitoring for takes, and reporting. So we have annual and 3-year reporting cycles built into the permit to make sure that we're on track with our goals and objectives. We have performance and success criteria. So how do we know that what we're doing is working, is doing what we hope it's doing? And then adaptive management strategy. So how do we account for unforeseen circumstances? So this is a big section. Our vision for the CP is for a thriving fishery that operates alongside recovering populations of humpback whales, blue whales, and leatherback sea turtles. Our agency's mission and fishery management policies serve to guide WDFW staff in the first half of this vision. And our CP's goal is focused on actualizing the second half of this vision, so to reduce the risk of entanglement the fishery poses for covered species. We've broken this goal down into measurable objectives that we hope to achieve during the 20-year permit period. And sort of broadly, they include reducing vertical lines, so an easily quantifiable reduction in risk, facilitating gear innovation, providing education and outreach support, improving fishery monitoring, and filling critical information gaps. So these are the measures our Fish and Wildlife Commission adopted, and we have implemented in 2020 and 2021, and they form the foundation of our conservation plan. The measures were informed by what we know about the timing of entanglements in Washington. So first we have this 1/3 pot limit reduction across the board that goes into effect May 1 each year and remains in place for the rest of the season, so September 15th. There have been entanglements over the years during the month of April, but when you look at Washington specific data, only 3 were associated with Washington crab gear, 2 gray whales, and 1 humpback. So that's why we chose May 1. Our summer buoy tag requirement now helps us enforce this pot limit reduction, and it helps us with the implementation of our expanded gear recovery program. So we've had a gear recovery program since 2009, so before it was cool. And for years, it kicked in at the end of the season in September. But now with summer buoy tags, folks can get a permit to recover any gear starting May 1 that does not have that required summer buoy tag on it. So it gets more gear out of the ocean sooner and reduces risk during those critical summer months when whales are more common off our coast. We had a replacement tag program in past years that essentially allowed fishers to request buoy tags to replace those that may have been lost due to weather or vessel interactions, so they could continue to fish their full complement of pots. But we've been phasing this program out progressively, and so this upcoming season will be the first where the program has been completely eliminated. We've also required line marking in the fishery. So line marking is key to addressing the data gap associated with entanglement records in which the gear cannot be identified. So often we get entanglement reports where the only visual is a blurry photo from someone's cell phone, and the clearly marked buoys and tags are not in the photo. Maybe the whale might be moving around a lot, trying to free itself, rolling. The weather might make for poor visibility. So line marking is a way to help increase the likelihood of correctly attributing entanglements to the appropriate fishery. So this is also important for the monitoring program of our CP. Ours is the first fishery to take this step, but a lot more work still needs to be done on the West Coast to coordinate this. Ultimately, it might be that every fixed gear fishery on the West Coast will need uniquely identifiable line. We also want to make sure that there's a regulatory pathway to allow some gear testing. Right now, experimental gears are prohibited under existing rules for the coastal Dungeness crab fishery, but using experimental fishing permits could open the door to that testing in a way that allows for engagement with WDFW fishery managers and enforcement, and also that includes the engagement with coastal crab industry members. So this is part of a package that has an effective date of January 2022. We can show that all these tools reduce risk, but through monitoring, we will need to continue to show that these are effective tools for reducing impact as well. So that's where monitoring is key, and it's also where it's tricky. So monitoring is a required part of the CP, and it must track a couple of things. It's kind of confusing, but I'm hoping the way that I'm laying it out will make sense. There's a couple of different parts, so it must track compliance with the terms of the permit. It must track impacts the fishery has on species of concern, and it must track progress or achievement of CP goals and objectives. And so actually where we're running into the biggest challenge is this number 2, that tracking the impacts the fishery has on species of concern. So historically, entanglement reporting has been exclusively opportunistic. So somebody out on a boat reports an entanglement while they're doing something else. But this does not meet minimum requirements for ITP issuance. And so with other fisheries, they'll meet those monitoring requirements by implementing observer programs to monitor bycatch. So this is essentially, entanglements are essentially marine mammal bycatch or turtle bycatch. So observer programs would be an impractical monitoring tool for fixed gear entanglements because of the nature of the fishery and the fact that observer coverage would only be during times when that gear is being actively tended, when most of the time the gear is just deployed in the water, not being actively tended. So to address this need for monitoring, we're going to need to use more creative thinking to piece something together. And so this is what we've started with, a monitoring program. And this is also how listeners can help if they're interested. It's going to be a West Coast wide effort. You'll see at the center of it is a network of like volunteers or citizen scientists. And it will need to be a West Coast wide effort. So if you or someone you know likes to sit outside and look for whales in your free time, I'd love to talk to you. A lot of folks go whale watching in Puget Sound, but there's not nearly the same level of engagement off the outer coast of Washington. There's a lot fewer people out here. So yeah, if you know any of them, tell them to drop me a line. Also, if you have expertise in creating or mobilizing a network of citizen scientists, I'd love to talk to you as well. It's not my area of expertise, but I'd like it to become one. So if that resonates with you, drop me a line. Now, I mentioned performance and success criteria. The CP requires that our management tools are not only effective, but measurable. So this table shows the average pots used during the 2013 to 2019 period and the expected cumulative reduction in lines in the water when you consider all the measures we've implemented to reduce entanglements, including our pot limit reduction seasonally, our expanded gear recovery program, and the elimination of our replacement tag program. So for example, I'll highlight for listeners too, by 2023, after we have the chance to analyze all of the reduction measures together, we're expecting a line reduction to range from 37 to 42% of what was in the water during the recent past. So significant reduction. That said, we also need to have a plan that describes procedures for dealing with unforeseen circumstances. So adaptive management is what will help us do that. It's a tool that promotes flexible decision-making by providing options for sort of additional or more dynamic management tools. And so it allows for decisions to be adjusted as we learn more about management actions or other events. Here are a few tools that we have the authority to implement in an adaptive capacity. So pot limits, we have an extensive history of using pot limits to achieve fishery management goals. So we can expand by time, area, or a combination. We could implement a coastwide pot limit, for example, May through September. And this would, of course, be in coordination with Oregon and California. We could implement closed areas or roll out gear modifications, weak buoy links to help whales free themselves, or pop-up gear, also referred to as ropeless gear. This is pending future and actually current R&D. And there's other effort reductions that could be at our disposal. So pot stacking or potentially a buyback program. So there's some things that might trigger the need for adaptive management. So unforeseen circumstances, part of our job is to try to foresee those unforeseen circumstances. And so those come in a couple of different categories. The monitoring related is potentially not meeting CP commitments or exceeding permitted take, not meeting CP objectives. Those could trigger an action. Environmental, so if there's a marine heat wave or a harmful algal bloom, it might require some nimble management actions. And informational, this is sort of an other bin, and that means that if we learn more about the situation, we can use that information in an adaptive capacity to make appropriate management decisions. So in summary, proactive precautionary approach is key. So we're fortunate our industry stakeholders have been engaged from the very beginning, and they've shown strength, resiliency, and flexibility to an extent that is really important in terms of being able to address conservation challenges quickly and effectively. We have, with the support of our industry, demonstrated this proactive precautionary approach for many years. We had pot limits and gear marking requirements since before entanglements started spiking and gaining attention for over a decade, in fact. We were the first on the West Coast to implement both a derelict gear recovery program and a requirement to mark lines in the fishery at different times. We're continuing to address this issue of entanglements with the same proactive precautionary approach to fishery management that we've always had. The reality is management is now more complex than ever and will likely continue to become more complex into the future as we continue to address not just marine life entanglements, but also accelerating impacts of climate change and the potential nexus between those issues. And there may be new challenges associated with proposals to utilize more ocean space, perhaps in competition with existing ocean uses like Dungeness crab fishing. So these are things we'll need to keep learning about and addressing. Our management approach will likely need to be nimble, considering all of these things. That's the challenge of today, tomorrow, and years to come. And part of that is monitoring for the CP specifically, the challenge that we're looking to address, maybe with your help today and tomorrow. So if you have ideas, questions, comments, please reach out. My email is on there, victoria.nor@dfw.wa.gov. I'll love talking with you about all things entanglements. Acknowledging my team at WDFW, including Heather Hall and Dan Ayers. I also want to thank you all for listening and encourage you to stay engaged and keep an eye out for a public release of our draft CP at some point in the coming months. Talk to me, talk to your friends, submit a public comment, any of that. But most of all, yeah, thanks for your time and attention today.
Thank you, Victoria. We really appreciate having you here at the Ocean Life Symposium and on KGUA in Wallala 88.3 FM. I'm sure Scott Mercer of the Mendonoma Whale and Seal Study, Scott and Tree, brought this great conference to us online. You've got some comments or questions, I'm sure.
Yes, it's really great to meet you, Victoria. I got to just tell a quick story about how Victoria ended up being on this. We had just had a speaker drop out, and I needed somebody who was really good and somebody who was working on a vital and current topic. We were driving through Nevada on our way back here from Maine, and suddenly I get an email, and it's Victoria about some other issue altogether. And I tracked her down finally through an email and sent her an invitation, and she graciously accepted and just gave us this wonderful talk. So I feel very lucky to have her here, and that's just the way she just dropped out of thin air into this program.
That is so great.
Yeah.
What a connection.
That was wonderful. That was really great, Victoria. Fantastic.
Now, Victoria, some of the points you made meshed perfectly with a previous speaker this week, Helen Colleen from Bodega Marine Lab.
With the plastics and microplastics.
Well, that was Jennifer.
Oh, that was Jennifer. I keep mixing these two up.
Helen was talking about ocean warming.
Ocean warming, right.
And the compression of colder water, richer water in towards shore, bringing the whales into areas where they hadn't necessarily been. And then you showed the spike with the blob and the increase in entanglements. So I love when that happens. This unintentionally just meshed perfectly with each other.
It all comes together.
Yeah, sadly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that up by British Columbia? Is that on the map? Is that what you're talking about, Scott?
It was more of a graph, bar graph showing the spike in entanglements.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And the years were matched up perfectly with the years of the blob and the overlap from that. And then Helen's lecture she gave the other day, when she was talking about when whales were showing up in unexpected numbers in unexpected places, and she showed how this compression across the shelf towards shore of the richer, colder water, which attracted the whales in there because that's where the food was. And that just coordinated perfectly with some points that Victoria was making today, especially that graph that she showed with the spike in entanglements.
Well, I have one last question, and then we are going to be talking about who we're going to be seeing tomorrow. But Victoria, you mentioned something about soft-shell crab, and I didn't catch all of it. Could you describe that again, that part?
Yeah, of course. So the fishery has opening and closing dates. The opening date is variable, as I mentioned, but essentially the closed part of the season is to protect those soft-shelled crab. because it aligns with the primary molting period of crabs. So that's why they're soft-shelled. Does that answer your question?
It did. Thank you for reiterating that. And thank you so much for participating in this year's Ocean Life Symposium. We really are glad to have you with us, and we'll look forward to next year too. So Scott Mercer, thank you too for bringing this conference to us. And we are going to now talk a little bit about some of the guests that we're going to have here tomorrow. Thank you again, Victoria.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. That was wonderful.
Yeah.
Tomorrow, coming up first in the morning, we have Brianna Zuber. She's from the Mendocino College, the weird, wonderful ocean oddballs and particular partners. That sounds like a fun one.
It will be. And then we have from Rich Riles, it's Rich Reels of Smelts. He's going to talk about, again, how ropeless, how do you say that, Scott? Buoyless? Buoyless. Thank you. Fishing can save cetaceans and the fishing industry.
And then we have Jack Barkowski from Moss Landing Marine Labs. He's going to be talking about the science of entanglements,
More
and
stuff.
he's doing his master's there, and it's going to be fascinating.
Right. And then we've got Cindy McKennis Bierman, who's from Seven Seals Whale Watch and the Ocean Alliance. And she's going to be talking about using a life-size inflatable humpback whale as a teaching tool. That is going to bring us to the end of day 4 of the Ocean Life Symposium. Thank you for watching on YouTube. Thank you for listening online. We do have our radio streaming around the world at kgua.org. We're going to have this uploaded to SoundCloud later, but you can always watch it on YouTube. It is 12 o'clock and you are listening to KGUA in Wallala 88.3 FM. And again, go to our website, kgua.org, for the interactive schedule. Thank you, Paul Mundy, for helping me host today, Peggy Berryhill in the background, and also all the others who have helped us bring this conference together, Roberta Chan, Jeannie Berry, Scott and Tree Mercer. This has been a fantastic day. Thank you again. And we're going to say goodbye to all of our watchers.